I yield.
I thank the gentleman, and first of all, for his great leadership on this subject. The gentleman from the Hoosier State and I came in together back in 2010. We were elected to this Congress, and I can't speak necessarily for the gentleman. I can only speak for myself, but I'd almost bet that my friend from Indiana would agree that we came up here to tackle the nation's biggest problems. You know, Mr. Speaker, the framers of our country were visionaries. They got it right on the formation of the country and the established government that guides our every decision. They not only had the foresight to establish constitutional principles and processes that address the challenges of the day, but that sustain and guide our nation now 2.25 centuries later. What you have just heard in the last few minutes, and I've been witness to the presentation made by my friend from South Carolina with commentary from the gentleman from Indiana, I'm going to present many of the same arguments in the time that I have before you today because I think they are worth repeating, and my chart may show it a little bit differently. But, Mr. Speaker, I came to the Congress and was immediately placed on the Appropriations Committee. And as a member of that committee, one of my jobs is to look after the discretionary piece of the federal budget. And has already been mentioned, the discretionary piece of the federal budget is getting squeezed. There was a time in the not-too-distant past that discretionary spending was the largest share of spending, and as was mentioned by my friend from South Carolina, things that you recognize your federal government for, and he articulated a number of those. But when you look at this particular chart, and this end of the chart would represent 1962, the other end of the chart is just about 3 years from now in 2018. You can see, in case you have trouble seeing, let me just go through the color coding here. The purple at the top is the amount of money that we have to pay year in and year out to service our debt. Those of you at home that, Mr. Speaker, that have a credit card bill that comes in every month, there will be a category there, a block there that says minimum payment due. The minimum payment is usually the reflection of interest due on that account and not necessarily a reduction in the principal amount owed. And that's exactly what this purple is. That's the minimum payment due year in and year out that we have to make in order to satisfy the creditors, the people that have given money to this country, loaned money to this country for governmental purposes. And as you can see, Mr. Speaker, this chart shows that area in purple has grown down through the years. It tightened up a little bit back a few years ago, but now if you look at that last piece of it, from right here, you'll notice that it's taking a dip, and if we extended that chart out for many more years, it gets progressively worse. The next color is red, and that's the reflection of mandatory spending talked about by the gentleman before me that constitutes how much money that we have to spend year in and year out to pay for the programs that people all across this country are entitled to. The biggest driver of the long-term consequences of mandatory spending would be Medicare. And there are many charts that will show you the glide path that Medicare is on. But, Mr. Speaker, something happened last night at midnight that affects the ongoing cost of that piece of mandatory spending. And that is 11,000 people celebrated a birthday as we rolled into the new day. 11,000 people aged into that program. Now, Mr. Speaker, tonight at midnight, something else is going to happen that's going to influence the growth of that area in red. And that is another 11,000 people, thereabouts, are going to age into this program that they automatically qualify for when they turn 65. And thankfully, more and more people are living well beyond 65. And I'm I'm glad for that. But if you look at that red, coupled with the purple, you can see that since 1962, it has commanded a much larger share of federal spending. And it is putting a tremendous squeeze on the programs that people like me, as an appropriator, have to work with to fund the other essential forms of government. In fact, I have a lot of people say to me when I go home that, you know, Mr. Womack, you're an appropriator. You're in charge of all this spending. You ought to be able, with your vote and with your leadership on that committee, you ought to be able to see that the books of the federal government are balanced. But, Mr. Speaker, if you look at the last two colors, the green, which is non-defense spending, and the blue, which represents defense discretionary spending, these two colors have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, so small that now that they represent about a third of our spending. And you do the math. Gentleman from South Carolina would be happy to yield.
Yeah, I just thank the gentleman from Arkansas for raising what I think is such a fundamental point with regard to government spending. And it really raises the crossroads I think that we're at as a society. Because in my mind, I keep going out to about 2025, which you well illustrate on that chart. And then at that point, we're only going to have enough money for interest and entitlements and nothing else without either raising taxes substantially, cutting benefits substantially, or running very large deficits going forward. And ultimately, there comes a point of no return, as you correctly point out with your charts, wherein the world financial markets won't lend you anymore. So I think you're on to a remarkably important theme, and I think it underscores the degree to which we're going to have an important debate in this chamber in really the next month, because what the president essentially said is that I'm not going to deal with this. If you look fundamentally at the White House budget, it at the core abandons this notion of financial discipline. I mean, it adds $2.2 trillion in new taxes. It adds $8.5 trillion in new debt. It goes from running structural $500 billion deficits to $1.1 trillion deficits with no end to deficits in sight. They continue to grow. And so this theme that you're getting on with regard to the mandatory component and the interest component of government spending, I don't think can be underscored enough. And I don't want to interrupt you, but it just hit me as you were talking.
Well, I'm glad the gentleman did interrupt. And to carry our colloquy just a little bit further, the gentleman from South Carolina is the former governor of South Carolina. And so he's had some experience at dealing with balanced budgets and having to live within your means as a former chief executive of a state, one of the 50 states in our country. So you have a great appreciation for how important it is to be able to craft budgets that live within your means and address the major drivers of what could be deficit spending at the state level.
And would the gentleman yield for one more second?
I'd be happy
to. Just on that point, though, it's so interesting that ultimately it's not just about balancing budgets, because I think that a lot of people from across this country look at the carrying on and the going on of Congress and they say, it's about green eye shades and it's about trying to balance some numbers. No, it's about sustaining this republic. Because, Admiral Mike Mullen, when asked what is the biggest threat to the American society, didn't answer China, he didn't answer Russia. His answer was the biggest threat to the American way of life is the national debt. And if you were to look at, a whole host of different folks across, recent history, I mean, Paul Kennedy wrote, I think, an excellent book entitled The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, and his premise was that economic supremacy was the precursor to military supremacy, that for a civilization to be able to continue to project force. I think it's so interesting that, the Prime Minister of Israel was here earlier today. We heard Prime Minister Netanyahu lay out his concerns with regard to some things happening in the Middle East. But America's variability, to whether it's in engaging with an ally like Israel or whether it's engaging in a whole host of other conflicts that are, innumerable and guaranteed across the next 25 years or so, our ability to impact those things will be driven, frankly, by these economic numbers. I mean, I think it's been maligned, but Reinhard and Rogoff, a professor from the University of Maryland and a professor from Harvard, wrote a book entitled This Time It's Different. They chronicled 800 years of financial history, and there have been some questions about how they got to some of their numbers. But the larger premise was, in that title. This time it's different. What you're pointing out is that no, it's never different. Math always works, and there's something fundamental about our civilization's need not just to balance budgets for balanced budget's sake, but to be able to sustain our ability to project power and maintain a way of life that we love, I think is underlying these very charts that you're showing.
I thank the gentleman reclaiming my time. I just want to say before I go to my next chart that this isn't an option for us. To allow this to continue on this path without the interaction of this Congress and solutions offered by this Congress, many of which are going to be big deals, because when you get this far along in the problem, the solutions to the problem get much larger, going to require a lot more political courage. But we have to address it, because if we don't, in just a few years beyond the 18 time frame that this chart shows, there will be no money left for the items that you see in green and blue. And let me hasten to remind you that the items in blue is national defense. And I know I'm running.
Could the gentleman yield for one more second?
I will.
It just on that point, I love keeping strange jotted notes in my office. Again, the number that you're getting at, because you're now touching on national defense. You know, Habsburg Spain defaulted on all or part of its debt 14 times between 1557 and 1696. Pre-revolutionary France saw 62% of its royal revenue go into interest payments alone. Britain, between World War I and World War II, saw interest payments climb to 44% of the British budget. In the Ottoman Empire, interest payments and amortization rose from 15% of its budget in 1860 to 50% in 1875. In other words, this music has been played before with disastrous consequences, and that's why I think it's relevant. You know, Keynes was actually quoted. He quoted Lenin, of all folks, and Lenin's quote was this: "There's no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of a society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose." What you're laying out with the chart that you so appropriately lay before the Congress is the very formula that Lenin himself was talking about in things that will challenge not only defense, but the way in which a government sustained itself.
I appreciate the gentleman's perspective. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to show you this one. I was fortunate to get elected in 2010 by a significant majority of the people in the 3rd District of Arkansas. I consider that area of our state to be the most dynamic in all of our state. It's got a lot going for it. It's got great jobs, great health care, wonderful educational institutions, effective governments, the University of Arkansas Razorbacks. I mean, there's a lot of great things you can say about the area that I represent. And it's different than a lot of places around our country. I will submit to that. And while I made a promise to the people that elected me, the biggest promise that I made, the one that I hold closest to my heart, and the promise that drives all of the decisions that I make, particularly to my friends that have joined me here in the chamber today, regarding budgets, deficits, debt, long-term spending, and those kinds of things, are the promises I made to these two young men right here. This is Liam. He's 8. And that's Caden. Caden's not even 2 yet. They're cousins. These are my grandkids. When I look into the eyes of these two precious little boys, I see the innocence of youth, but I also see something that they can't see. I see a tremendous burden that is growing every day, every week, every year, that these two kids have had nothing to do in creating, and that is a mountain of debt and interest payments for borrowed money that go as far as the eyes can see.
Would the gentleman yield on that point
for
one more second? And again, I think you're capturing, in essence, the totality of this debate, because there's a guy up at the University of Boston called Lawrence Kotlikoff. He wrote a book called The Coming Generational Storm, and its premise is really built up around your two grandkids, because he says that the imputed tax for a child born into America today is about 84%. 84%. I mean, our civilization won't work. A market-based economy doesn't work with an 84% tax rate. And yet that's what he said is coming those two young children's way in the event that nothing is done to change the course and trajectory of the way that Washington's spending money. He says that the total debt really amounts to around $200 trillion. So it hit me as I was looking into your two grandchildren's eyes there in the photograph, and I'd yield back with that point.
I want to give you some perspective before I close, Mr. Speaker. The only budget that we have laying out there right now is the President's budget. It arrived on time, never balances, never, and continues to add a lot of taxes and a lot of debt and a lot of interest burdens on the generations of these two kids right here. But here's what's inescapable. The net interest on the debt that we will pay this year, and I might need some help on this, Mr. Rokita, it's about $250 billion.
Yeah, too much.
$250 billion. It's a lot of money. Build a lot of roads and bridges, educate a lot of people, pay for a lot of things. About $250 billion, give or take. The President's budget, if you roll it out for 10 years, in the 10-year window, before this young man can vote and before this young man turns 12, the net interest on the debt will rise to $785 billion a year. That is not a sustainable path. And that's why I was pleased to accept the appointment to the Budget Committee as one of the three appropriators assigned to this committee. It's why I enjoy the work that I do. It's why I appreciate so much my friend from Indiana, my friend from Georgia, my friend from South Carolina, and the others that will parade down here and talk about these issues. They are the most serious things that affect domestic America today. And out of deference to these two young men and to their parents, Will and Amanda and Kaylee and Philip, it is my hope and my prayer that we will find the courage to support the solutions, large as they may be, to save America's next greatest generation. And with that, I yield back my time.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Arkansas. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, you see why he was elected mayor of Rogers, Arkansas. You see why he's a leader in our U.S. has been a leader in our U.S. military, and you see how and why he leads on the floor of this House. I want to again